Matthew 15, surprising faith from surprising places. We've noted already the recurring pattern with Matthew, Jesus' works and Jesus' words. We've also noticed the pattern of an increasing rejection towards Jesus from the Pharisees and the scribes. And the response of Jesus to that Jesus turns instead to the disciples and to those who are willing to listen to his words. Well, that pattern certainly continues here in Matthew 15 and 16. Matthew 14 brought significant conflict around the question of the Sabbath keeping, and the Pharisees attacking Jesus as a law breaker. We saw instead that Jesus is the true law fulfiller. But that's in terms of actions, Jesus' miracles, what he's performing on the Sabbath day. Matthew 15 and 16 are going to take us instead in the direction of his teaching. And we're going to see the same kind of conflict surrounding his teaching, them now rejecting what he says. So in chapter 14, they rejected his works. In chapter 15 now, they reject his words. This discussion takes us into the first section of the chapter, and I'm going to show you three patterns that become significant in chapter 15. The first pattern is the question of defilement. And this is an important question, even connected to the Old Testament. Leviticus chapter 11 talked at some length about the question of defilement. So it is a legitimate Old Testament concern. You might recognize this using the word uncleanness. Well, you see that right here. The question is, what defiles a man? And Jesus teaches that it's not what goes into the mouth, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles a man. These things proceed out of the mouth, and they defile the man. A second pattern that's interesting in this section, and something we need to note, is Jesus' description of the Pharisees and the scribes. So again, you're going to see this as a repeated pattern. The Pharisees and the scribes are the ones who come to Jesus. Jesus confronts them, and one of the disciples points out to him, you know that the Pharisees were offended by this. Jesus' answer is, well, if these tares need to be uprooted, then fine. Let them alone. They are blind guides. Let the blind lead the blind. Both will fall into the pit. And the point in that is to say that the interaction is explicitly focused on them. They're the ones who are bringing these charges against him. But finally, and probably the most important of these three, is the pattern with tradition, commandments, the Word of God. And here, notice the Pharisees' charge. The disciples are breaking the tradition of the elders. Jesus, of course, cites that tradition. He knows the tradition. But the contrast you have to catch here, that's critical to understanding what's happening here, is the contrast between the tradition of the elders and the commandments of God. Tradition of the elders, he says, and they want to know why he would dare to break the tradition of the elders. Jesus replies to them, and why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? God commanded, and now he cites directly from the Old Testament law. But you have ways to step around that so that someone can get around the responsibility of honoring Father. So for the sake of your tradition, and here's the critical point, you have nullified, you have made void the Word of God. In fact, it goes further. You have actually replaced the doctrines, the truth, and you have taught as doctrines the mere commandments of men. Your traditions have now come to supplant the Word of God. I'll pause for a second here. There is an interesting pattern even in the archaeological evidence. We can recognize that this question of washing your hands or ceremonial defilement was a major concern of Judaism at the time. This is drawn, full disclosure, from Qumran. It's not in Judea or within the Jerusalem system. But also within Jerusalem, you can find many examples of ancient mikvahs. And these are baptismal pools or washing pools, a place where a person could go down and they could wash themselves in order to be ritually clean. And there were even very specific requirements about the water being running water and the nature of the water, where it comes from, and all of those concerns to make sure that the person was completely in keeping with all of the traditions and the expectations. That continues even up until contemporary Judaism. You can find vestiges, or you can find continuing practices, not just full body cleansing, but hand cleansing, and all of the rules about how this must be done, and it's quite specific. And the question then goes with this: when Jesus is allowing his disciples not to follow all of these traditions, it's the same question I asked before. Does that mean that Jesus is a lawbreaker? Because he comes in and he destroys some of the expectations and the traditions that had built up. Admittedly, and recognizing that they were built up originally for the intent of carefully guarding the law. And the answer is no. We have a very strong statement in Matthew 5:17. Jesus did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill. The difference here, and the critical reality, is that Jesus is prepared to attack their traditions. And it points further. I just cited Matthew 5:17, the Sermon on the Mount. But remember how Matthew continues to explain this idea, or how Jesus explains this idea in the Sermon on the Mount. The pattern of "you have heard that it was said." And over again, that pattern is followed with "but I say unto you." And the significance of that pattern is, here are the traditions that have been passed down, the authorities that have given their word about how it ought to be done. Jesus says, no, I will tell you what is true law keeping and law fulfillment. Why? Critically, because I am the fulfillment of the law. And not only the fulfillment of the law, but Jesus is the law giver. Jesus is none other than God himself. If that then brings about conflict with the Pharisees, well, then so be it. And you have to recognize the significance and weight of that as well. Jesus is, by this, saying that the preeminent authorities of the time are wrong. He's going to correct them. And that's his answer. Do you know the Pharisees were offended? Well, let it be. Every plant that my Father has not planted will be rooted up. They're blind guides. And Jesus goes on to explain that it's not what enters into the heart, or into the mouth, meaning you've got to follow all of the specifics. The concern here is the heart. Don't worry yourself about the specifics of the traditions. Worry yourself about the specifics of the law. God has given you specific things you must follow. And it is the heart, according to Deuteronomy and according to Jesus' ministry. The heart that is defiled, and out of the heart comes the defilement. Critical distinction here is that the person themselves is the problem. It's not as though I am pure and therefore if I can keep everything away from me, I'll be okay. But it is from within that most of the problem comes. But that then leads us to a contrast, and the contrast is in the next section. If the concern here is how one can avoid defilement, one of the important ways a person would try to avoid defilement is to stay away from defiled people. Stay away from the Gentiles, the Canaanites, and the people that would bring about defilement. And actually what you find on the contrary here with Jesus is that he's going to those kinds of people. Matthew 15:21. Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. This is way up on the Atlas, up on the northern side of Israel, and far enough that you're talking a very strongly Gentile region. Just to give you a sense of how far we are away from Jerusalem, and the reality that these cities are known as places of complete paganism. So Jesus is in the region now that we would least expect. He's far away from the center. And he's encountering Gentile people. This word Canaanite is a very old word. It's probably calling to mind all of the stories back from Joshua and the conquest. It's not an expected word here, but it's certainly a way of saying a Gentile woman. And she comes to Jesus with a desperate need. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon. Now, this section that follows can definitely bother us. And the reason it will bother us is because of Jesus' response to her. Hear his words. Jesus is speaking to her to say, I came only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Lord, help me. It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs, he says. But even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And why would Jesus speak to someone like this? Well, there are a couple of details that are striking about this that I think help answer the questions. First, I think the use of the word Canaanite here is probably a little evocative to point to some of the stories we have when we think of Israel entering the Promised Land and the surprising faith of Rahab, or later the surprising faith of Ruth. You have some people that are Canaanites that actually come around and express greater and clearer and more faith than the Jewish people. So you have some contrasts here that point to something similar in this case, where Israel is rejecting, this Gentile is accepting. Another pattern that's interesting here in terms of Jesus' ministry is that earlier he has already interacted with Gentiles like this. Twice before. He's interacted with the Samaritan woman in John 4. He's already interacted with the Gentile centurion in Matthew 8. So it's not that Jesus hates Gentiles, but something deeper is going on. And I think putting those pieces together, I think Jesus is testing her. Watch his response to her when she responds in clear faith. Jesus answered and said to her, "O woman, great is thy faith. Be it unto thee even as thou wilt." And her daughter was made whole. And that is echoing an earlier statement he made to another Gentile, Matthew 8. "I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel." It is making the point that we've been establishing here. Jesus Christ comes to Israel. They turn from him. And actually, it's the it's the Gentiles who are willing to accept and respond. We find faith in surprising places. We find faith among the Gentiles. But it's not just this woman, and it's not just this incident. Watch the pattern from here. Jesus has performed many mass healings, and this is a pattern that's worth watching as you move across Matthew 9. He went through all the cities and he proclaimed the gospel, healing every disease, every affliction. Here you see another description of just mass healings, lots of people healed. And again, Jesus healed them all. They sent all that were in that region. They brought to him all who were sick. Matthew 19, large crowds followed him. He healed them all there. I mean, you've got this strong pattern across the gospel. But the interesting thing about this particular context is that we're finding Jesus doing a mass healing like this, and it's among Gentiles. Matthew 15:29, Jesus went beside the Sea of Galilee, and the great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, many others, put them at his feet. He healed them. Now, how do I know that this is Gentiles? And to say this, I do have to point to the Gospel of Mark that talks about the same incident, the feeding of the 4,000. And it specifically tells us that this incident happened in Decapolis, which is a definitely Gentile region outside of Herod's jurisdiction, outside of the Jewish region. So part of this is the confluence with Mark. But it's not just that. Notice the people's response at the end. They glorified the God of Israel. And that language is there to say these Gentile people are looking at the works of Jesus in awe, and they're recognizing that here is something fulfilling the Jewish promises. The Gentiles are more believing than the Jews. If I continue down in the chapter, here is the feeding of the 4,000, and this is very much parallel to the feeding of the 5,000 that we saw just before. You see a lot of details that are similar. But I think the point, again, when we talk about the Gentile and Jewish contrast, is that Jesus is performing the same miracle that he did before, but this time it's for Gentiles. And I would note a final point that makes this, at this point at the end or the conclusion of it, Jesus departed from there, went to the region of Magadan. His ministry and his focus is now going to continue on, not just among the Jews, but among the Gentiles. That all is very striking for our point, the point that Jesus' ministry, turning away from the Pharisees who have rejected, is focused on those who are willing to accept. But there's an interesting pattern also in the middle of the chapter, not just Pharisees versus Gentiles, but a pattern with the disciples. The disciples make emerge in this section. They make an entrance. And the disciples came and said, do you know the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? And Peter's question later to him, explain the parable to us. And Jesus explaining that to them with a rebuke. What's going on with the disciples? If this is the strong rejection of the Pharisees, if this is the strong acceptance of Gentile people, the disciples somewhere in the middle are kind of coming slowly to an understanding. And that pattern of slowly appreciating the richness of what Jesus has taught is another pattern that we've noted. Jesus slowly teaching, discipling, and bringing forward the disciples in their understanding. Conclusion or summary of the passage. We've already seen from much earlier, Jesus confirming that salvation is not by ethnicity, confirming that being Jewish is not enough. What's interesting about this passage is that Jesus has gone on to give us even clearer statement of a focus of what it means or how someone would come. It's not by ethnicity, but how will I enter into the kingdom? And we've seen kind of hints of this already in the past, but now we see it more clearly. Jesus focuses on the heart. What is within the man is what defiles a man. And Jesus focuses specifically on faith, the response of this woman. And Jesus' answer to her, great is your faith. It's the faith now that we see will make all the difference in a person's response to Jesus. And that's only going to point to the next chapter, because if I ask something like faith in what? Faith believing what? What kind of faith? The next chapter is going to answer that with a clear confession from Peter to Jesus. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Followed by Jesus teaching about what he will do. He will go to Jerusalem, he will suffer, he will be killed, and he will rise again on the third day. Faith in what? Faith in the person of Jesus and faith in his work. And that faith comes not from the places you would expect it, not from the center of the religious establishment, but you discover that faith from a Gentile woman, Gentile crowds. The last places that you would expect respond to Jesus. The simple call of this chapter is that you and I are supposed to read and to be challenged not to be like the first group of people who are distracted by their own traditions and their own thinking, their own expectations about what it would mean to live well, but instead to come simply, humbly, like the woman, like the crowds, to come to Jesus in faith and respond to him knowing who he is and what he will do.